Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Grant Writing for Every Occasion workshop, sponsored by YSHRAB through funding provided by the NHPRC, the Wyoming State Archives, and the Wyoming State Library. My name is Sarah Davis, and I serve as the Wyoming State Archivist and YSHRAB Coordinator. I will be moderating the sessions today, so please feel free to send me a direct chat message or drop your questions in the main chat. Today's agenda includes session 4 of Money, 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 which starts here in a few minutes, and it will last until 9 a.m. This session is about budget, justification, and sustainability. The second session of the day is session 5, wrapping it all up from 9:30 to 10:30 a.m. This session will be a summary, presentation, documentation, and next steps. Session 6 will be a conversation with Dan Stokes, the Director of State Parks at the NHPRC. He will be identifying appropriate federal grants and creating applications tailored to particular programming. The last session of the day is an open discussion from 12:30 to 1:30. This is an opportunity for you to bring your questions and have a lively conversation with our guest presenters. At the end of the workshop, we'll send an email with links to a resources folder. I've also dropped a link to the resources folder in the chat box this morning. And this includes links to the presentation slides as well as additional resources. The email will also provide links to access the recordings of the workshop sessions after they have been posted online, and any additional resources for the workshop, and a link to the survey to help us identify, make our programming a little bit better and tailor our workshops to your needs and wants. This workshop is brought to you by the Wyoming State Historical Records Advisory Board and the Wyoming State Library. It is supported in part by an award from YSHRAB through the funding from the National Historic Publications and Records Commission, a division of the National Archives and Records Administration. The YSHRAB program is administered by the Wyoming State Archives, which is part of the Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources. Now, on to the main event. Susan Mark is the outreach librarian at the Wyoming State Library. She is one of 2 coordinators for the Wyoming State Library's Federal Library Service and Technology Act grants from the Institution of Museum and Library Services. She's written grants successfully for nonprofits and state government agencies, managed grant contracts, served on grant review committees, and conducted grant writing workshops. I'll turn it over to Susan for additional technical information and kick off session 4.
Are we ready to go on to everybody's favorite part, budgets? How do people feel about budgets? Throw it in the chat. It's not my favorite part. Oh, somebody's got it their wheelhouse. We've got ugh, love it, begging, okay. So we're all over the board on these. We're all over the board on budgets. I know that I got into this business to do something good in the world, not necessarily crunch numbers. I could have been a CPA had I, chosen that path in life. But anyway, we are going to move on and start it. Here's the slide I told you you'd be tired of by the end of these sessions. So people in your community need something. You have a plan. You're the perfect organization. Now we're going to talk money. So anyway, so what goes into a grant proposal budget? Budgets have to account for everything in the methods. So everything you said you were going to do, if you said staff were going to do the work, you need, generally most times staff will be in kind. You need to account for that. You need to stick to eligible costs and projects, at least where the funding you're asking for them is concerned. If you want to, put in some equipment to the project and they don't fund equipment, great, but you cannot ask for that out of the grant dollars. You have to show that you have adequate resources, that you are not going to run out of resources mid-project. This is something that, a lot of us in library world, we have a, oh, they'll make do kind of attitude, and you can't have it in a grant proposal, because if you ask for too little, if you show too little, they're going to doubt your ability to actually have the resources to complete the project. You generally have to demonstrate the ability to provide cash or in-kind match. not always cash, but generally in kind. It would be a pretty rare grant opportunity where they didn't ask you to put anything into the project in terms of resources. It has to make sense and it has to add up correctly. So, again, the make sense goes back to the three rules, the three cardinal rules of grant writing that are going to get you ahead of a lot of people, which are to make sense, follow directions, communicate with your funder. So, and budgets are estimates. So they are going to be squishy. So the budget justification, that's where you show how you can nail the jello to the tree, because we know the budgets are often, you don't know exactly what's going to happen generally. You may find it takes more staff time than you thought. It may take less. You may need to shift things from one thing to another. This is where having that line of communication with your funder is so important, because if things do need to shift, you need to let them know, and then you could talk it over. They're not going to worry about $10 switched from one line item to another, but if there's a significant shift, then you need to be on the phone talking to them. So what is a budget justification? It's really showing where you got those numbers more than anything. Also a little bit, why those are needed. You don't have to go on and on and on, but the primary thing is showing that you did not pick numbers out of the air. You have a good idea of what it's going to take to pull off this project, and this is how you know. So again, a grant budget is an estimate. It's always an estimate, and they know that, you know that. Your justification is going to explain how those line items were estimated. You want to be thorough, but you want to be reasonable. You don't have to account for every piece of paper or even every ream of paper. You have to address every budget line item, and it might just be included on the budget form, or it might be a separate item. I've seen it both ways, and it really just depends on how elaborate the grant is, what their format is, going back to following their directions. If they want it on one spreadsheet with the justification written in across from the budget line items, that's how you do it. You can also do a separate page if they don't say. But I want you to keep in mind something about budgets. Some reviewers go straight to your budget. So you really need to have your budget be solid. So some budget items to consider, and these are the things that you're going to want to work through, is cash, both yours and theirs. How much cash are you going to need to pull this off? Your staff and or volunteer time. How many hours, the hourly rate. If it's staff time, don't forget the benefits. If it's volunteer time, you want it comparable to what private industry would do. There are salary indicators. If it's really just general volunteer time, independent sector, and this is in your resources folder, every year comes up with a number, and right now it's $28.54. So if you just have general volunteer time, you don't really know how to cost out, that's an accepted figure. But if you have something like a lawyer on your board who is offering his legal services, that's obviously going to be worth more, and you might want to account for that. Travel. Again, this is in your resources folder, how to cost out travel. It's accepted to use the GSA, the General Services Administration rates, for hotels, for per diem. For flights, you would want to get on Travelocity, and don't take the cheapest one, get a reasonable middle and of the road. For mileage, the Internal Revenue Service has their mileage number that's generally accepted. What you don't want is just a bulk $1,000 for travel. $1,000 for travel. You want to say, it's 6 trips, approximately this, approximately that, and come up with a reasonable number. Supplies could be physical items needed, pretty much anything, refreshments. I've worked on a poetry workshop where we've done it. It's always been one of our in-kind items, but one of the supplies was name badges. So just this, that, and the other. If it's a not quite construction project, just a few shelves, the supplies might be building supplies. So there's that. Equipment, usually there are very specific items if you're going for equipment, and you would of course cost those out. Space. If you are doing programs in your library, in your museum, don't forget the value of your space, because if you had to go out to a hotel and get a room, it would cost you something. So find out the approximate value and make sure that you account for that, because the more in kind, that's obviously going to be an in kind one. You're not going to charge the grant to use your space. But the more in kind you can put forward, it really strengthens your proposal. So services, these might be presenters. These might be online software services. They might be rentals. If you have to rent tables and chairs for something. They also might be if you have a grant project of the type, perhaps a pilot or demonstration project. It's a significant enough size that you're looking for an outside evaluator. That may be one of the services. Promotion, don't forget promotion. There are an awful lot of ways you can promote things without spending money. You can do it on your social media. You can send out press releases, put it on your website. You should, as we discussed earlier, maybe partner with some other organizations. So, you might have an local organization of daycare providers that you put out a program that will go to daycares and bring books and programming. So, but if you want to do any paid advertising, if you are looking at significant printing costs, those are the kind of things that you would want to be sure to include in your budget items and to show how you came up with those numbers. Outside contractors, this might be more of a building project. This is not something I have dealt with, but this is something that if you are doing a renovation and improvement, you're going to be getting those quotes. Now, indirect costs. A lot of grantors, a lot of funders do not allow these, but anytime you do a project, it's part of what you're doing, and there's an overall cost for keeping the lights on and keeping staff paid that doesn't really get accounted for specifically in the grant. You see these more often with federal grants. There may be a set amount. Our federal grant has a set amount that we take as indirect costs. It may be something that's negotiated. A lot of universities have a negotiated rate for federal grants. So, but if you're just dealing with your average run-of-the-mill library museum project, you're probably not looking at indirect costs. So let me see here. Before we go on to the first breakout, did we have any questions from anybody? I find it interesting that the people range everything from one of the easiest pieces of the grant process to ugh. So there's a lot of differing feelings about grant projects. So, and again, don't short yourself. You need to show that you are going to be able to pull this off. Are volunteer hours accounted for as in kind? Yes, absolutely. This is work that's going into the project. This is going to be in your methods that you are having volunteers do this work. And so if you have that in your methods and you don't have in your budget, then somebody who goes straight to your budget isn't going to know how you have the volunteer time to do it. So budget and methods have to match up. In fact, print them off side by side, go through, make sure there's nothing in your methods that you did not account for in your budget. The organization giving the $28.54 figure, and they also have it state by state. I think you have to register to get it state by state, but the general one, $28.54, is from independent sector. The link is in your resources folder, and it's pretty much, when you go with that, you've got an accepted cost. And again, if you've got somebody, some volunteer who's providing legal cost, who's providing accounting cost, something significantly more than that, then you would want to cost that out a little differently. So I think those are all the questions I'm seeing. Did we have any that came into you, Sarah?
That's all the questions we have for right now.
So let's move on to the first breakout. And I want you to talk over what resources do you need to complete your budget that will need to go into your project, that will need to go into your budget, and where will you get these from, and how will you determine dollar amounts. If you are watching this as a recording, pause this video and write this down. All righty, away we go. Looks like we have everyone back. From your discussion, did you have any takeaways, any insights, or any questions that we can address before we move on? We would love to hear your input. I know there's a lot of knowledge out there, so I'm sure there were some good things that came up in the discussion. So please use the chat and share what you talked about. Autumn, yes. Autumn says it's hard to say exactly how many books you plan to buy, but generally there's an average cost of books, and that's the kind of thing that you use, because some books will cost more than others, and it is escaping me. It's a publisher's organization that kind of gives an annual cost of books. Yeah, Rachel says it's not just the cost of a new fridge. There's delivery, taking the old one away, staff time to sell. So, you want to make sure that you are accounting for everything and not, suddenly finding you need $100 more that you don't have. Yeah, and Rex says on the books, that's what they do, is that they look at the type of books they're purchasing. Obviously trade paperbacks are going to be more than mass market paperbacks, and use average costs. Yes, Charlene, using volunteer hours as in-kind donation, having them keep track. I'm keeping track of my hours for this workshop. So yeah, you do have to do a little more research than you normally think. And you don't have to cost it out to the penny. You really don't, but you have to have reasonable figures with a reasonable justification behind them. So anybody have anything else to share? Yeah, one of their group participants found out that actual cost typically is higher than what you might originally think. And this is where the research into the budget goes in, because, as was it Rachel who said that, you've got to be reasonably thorough that you are accounting for all the costs. There is some theory of padding. You don't want to pad it too much, but you want to give yourself wiggle room. As I mentioned with Travelocity, if you're looking up what flights might cost, you don't want to say, oh, here's the absolute cheapest flight that, routes your presenter through 2 airports through Anchorage, Alaska on the way to Florida. Part of it is the research, but do not short yourself. If you get 3 estimates, do you need to show the results in the grant? Not necessarily. You've got the estimates, approximately what it's going to cost. So just put in the dollar figure, if you're kind of figuring you're going to take the lowest, go ahead and take that. But if you're not sure, take the middle one. Rex, yeah, this is an odd year, but factoring in for inflation has really taken off. So I know our economic analysis division does regular inflation costs for the different counties. Supply chain issues. This is a difficult one, and this created some issues this year for us in terms of a project we were using federal funds to get books for school libraries. You may need to ask for an extension. You may need to ask if supply chains are figuring into not being able to get the equipment, get the books you need. You will need to get on the horn with your funder and either shift things or ask for an extension or something along those lines. But they understand. They really understand when things like that happen, that that's out of your control. They will work with you. They don't want their money back. They really don't. So they will generally work with you to get it spent in a way that's still supporting the purposes of the grant. So anything else before we move on? The Google Docs link will be in your post-workshop email, or maybe Sarah can post it again. So what can go wrong with budgets? What could go wrong? You could ask for too much, either because you are not bringing enough in-kind to the table, or, if you're asking for too much excessive amounts, they may just think you're being wasteful. So, even though you want to give yourself enough wiggle room, you don't want to pad it to the point that they say these people are being extravagant or they won't use funds wisely. Asking for too little, we've discussed this before. They want to know you'll have the resources to actually complete the project as planned. Not bringing enough to the table, not enough in kind, just in general. Saying anything will help. This is one that the YSHRAB board has seen. You are doing a specific project for a specific proposal. If you want to include, if this project is not fully funded, we would need to change the scope of the project. They may come back and say that they cannot fully fund it. What can you do? And then at that point, you would have to negotiate with them as to whether you need to change the scope or you need to come up with more funds from somewhere. Sometimes this is a powerful fundraising tool because you can go to some of your regular funders that non-grant funders, and say, we have the opportunity for this grant. We need to come up with this much more money. Becomes in essence a matching grant. So, but don't flat out say anything will help. Submitting multiple budgets. This is another one that I have not seen, but when I talked with the YSHRAB board, people on it, they said this has happened. Don't make your funder choose. Pick a project. Don't give them options like that. So too vague, too little detail. There's a balancing act. As I said, you don't want to cost out every pencil, but you also don't want them to think you picked numbers out of the air. And then again, the budget doesn't match methods. Everything in your methods, everything in the project itself has to be accounted for in the budget. Everything in the budget has to be accounted for in the methods. If you have items in the budget that don't appear in the methods, they're going to wonder where this came from. And vice versa, they're gonna, if you have methods that aren't included in the budget, they're gonna wonder if you have enough resources. So, and last but not least, the numbers don't add up. And this seems a very obvious one, and it is, but you have no idea how many grant applications I've seen where the numbers don't add up. Triple check your numbers and have someone else triple check your numbers. Any questions before we move on to sustainability? Ideas for approaching budget and accounting numbers as part of a city organization. In that case, hopefully you've developed a good relationship with the bean counters in your city organization, and you can work with them to come up with a reasonable budget. Shirlene, is the city have governance over your organization? Yes. Yeah, you're gonna, hopefully you've built good relationships and you can work with them, but that's a case where you're going to have to work with them and say, we want to do it. This is what it's going to cost. This is what we have to put forward. So any other questions? All right, let's move on to sustainability. And so you've started down this path and you want to keep going. You know, if the evaluation comes back and this is something worthwhile to keep doing, you want to keep doing it. And the funder wants you to keep doing it generally, but they don't want to adopt you forever. If you find, you know, there are sometimes foundations that give to a certain organization and they're lifers, but that's not that common. If you're writing a proposal, you may be dealing with a funder who, you know, wants you to get it started and then keep it going. And it's sort of like everybody wants to be there to cut the ribbon on the bridge and nobody wants to repaint it year after year. And it becomes your issue as to how you're going to afford the paint. So, you know, future funding, you know, where are you going to find the funds to keep this going? Sharing results, you know, this is another way that you can tell the funder that this is going to go beyond the scope of just this grant project. Or is it a permanent change? I mean, if you have a capital construction grant, you build a building, it's going to be a permanent change. If you raise money for endowment through some kind of grant, you know, more often I've seen those as matching grants. You have a permanent change, you have a more solid endowment. So if it's a capacity building grant and you can show that your organization has greater capacity to do the work you want to do or to raise funds to sustain yourself. So, you know, those are three of the things that show that you have a sustainable project. So for future funding, this might just be a one-time project. Oftentimes workshops, conferences, even if it's something you do every year, would still be treated as a one-time project. The poetry workshop I'm involved in works that way, that they just focus on year to year. And if we want to keep it going, fine, but they're not invested in us keeping it going. You might have individual fundraising to take up the slack. And this is where the evaluation comes in handy to show the success. If you are going to rely on individual fundraising, you know, indicate what plan you have, even if the plan is just to take back the success of this project to your individual funders or focus on this, additional grants. You know, grants can be a tough way to live if you are relying on that to keep projects going, but that can be part of your future funding strategy. You might absorb it into the budget. And in this case, it may be you take your evaluation and you assess what else you're doing. We all have limited time. We all have limited funds. And it may be that this project is successful enough that something else you're doing that isn't making as much of a difference can go by the wayside, or you might be anticipating increases in your budget. You might be going back to, if you're part of a city or county, you might be going back for increased funds based on the success of the project. So those are the kind of things pretty much you want to show, unless it's a one-time project, more than anything, you want to show you have a plan. In terms of sharing results, there's presentations. I'm always seeing calls for proposals for conferences, and it's a great way to show off what you did, put a feather in your cap for your organization. You can write articles. If you're in professional associations where there's an active listserv, active communication with other members, you can put it out through there. I'm a member of the Association for Rural and Small Libraries, which has an amazingly active listserv. So you often see people saying, hey, we have this success at our library. Obviously, put it on your website, issue a press release. And one thing that you can do is create a how-to guide that you can share with other people to say, hey, this is what we did, and here's how you can do it. So there are a lot of ways to share results. And again, when in the sustainability section, you show that you're going to share your results, You're assuring the funder that the impact of this grant is going to extend beyond just the grant period they're funding. So those are some ideas for sustainability. Did anybody have any questions before we go on to the next breakout? Not seeing any. Oh, yes. Angie Bates asked, should you address sustainability in your proposal? Yes, this is a key component of your proposal. They want to know what your plans are. Again, unless it's a one-time project, their expectation is it's one time, yours is. This is one of the key components. All of these components we have gone into over the course of this workshop, and we'll review them in the session 5, are key components of your proposal. So yes, you definitely want to address this. We're going to go to the next breakout. If you're watching this as a recording, just write down your ideas for yourself. Let's put you into breakout rooms. Okay, I think we have everybody back with us. Did you have any questions, takeaways, insights that came out of your discussion? I'm really curious to hear what you all talked about. Please put them in the chat box and we'll discuss them. Start with, Linda Herget said, start with small grants and work your way up to big ones. Absolutely. You're going to have better luck starting out with a more local grant than you will if you start right off going to the federal government. Jennifer Hafferkamp, great idea for influencing other organizations through their own event, which is a good way to show sustainability. Yes, you are creating change that's going to sustain itself in your community by working with these other organizations, by influencing them. Partnerships, small local grants, key sustainability. There are, I know it's easier to get a Wyoming Arts Council grant than it is to get a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. So partnerships are definitely going to help. And those partners may put you onto opportunities. If you work with them and they come across an opportunity, they might give you a heads up. Okay, funded digitization through grants, now asking for budget funds to continue it. Yep, and that's one of the ways your evaluation is going to come in handy, because you'll be able to point to the success and how this is valuable. How does sharing results contribute to the sustainability of the project? It's basically your project is going to live on beyond what is happening, because when you share your results, other organizations can look to that. You can, they might contact you and say, how did you do it? Oh, teach workshops for writing memories. One of the team members suggested a grant for recording equipment to record memories. Yes, that is a great idea for what money to go for. Okay, were there any other questions on anything we've covered in this budget session? And Rebecca, the other half of your question, it does indeed act as a kind of marketing. Because hopefully you'll be communicating with your funder and showing them what you're doing to spread the word. And just because they don't want to adopt you doesn't mean they won't field requests from you in additional years. YO Poets, the workshop I deal with, we get grants many years from the Arts Council. Wow, this is a great way. Elizabeth has a great example of how starting with a smaller grant can lead to a bigger one. First grant started out with a 10,000 Southern Minnesota grant and grew to county CARES funding, and then got into a huge system-wide federal grant. So yes, and the other factor is not just that you show your past successes, you get better at grant writing with every time. We've done so many breakouts through this workshop because there is really no substitute for actually working through the process of a grant proposal in terms of learning it. And in that way, starting local and building out means that the people who are most likely to fund you get your earlier efforts. How do you mention previous funding of the project when applying for new funding? That, are you talking about continuing the funding? I mean, it's just something you would include in your narrative that last year we received a grant to start this and we were requesting this much money to continue the work. And I would probably put that in your summary, which is what we're getting to in session 5. Okay, other questions? Sarah, did anybody send any of them straight to you?
I don't see any additional questions. There was a question by Darby in the chat box.
If you budget costs for volunteers who aren't paid, wouldn't you end up with extra cash on hand? No, your volunteer hours would count as in kind. That is not something you would request out of the grant budget. Your grant budget is going to be the amount you are requesting is everything that you're needing the funds to complete. And so you would not end up with extra cash with your volunteer in kind. With that, Sarah, shall we conclude this session?
Yeah, thank you for joining us for session 4. We will be back at 9:30 for session 5, wrapping it all up.